Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Let me give you all a word of advice about using Zoom with earbuds. Is always check to see how loud your volume is. Oh, here's my son, by the way. He's in real life. There's scoop for a little bit. There you go. Oh, oh, sorry, he keeps disappearing. Whoa. All right. Thanks, Bubba. Um, so if you don't check your volume and you're trying to record your Zoom thing, there's a voice that says, recording in progress. You probably hear it on your end too, I guess, um, which ends up screaming that down your ear canals. So that's what I'm saying. You'll make that mistake once because that happened to me the other day. Well, um, as you all saw, my son is with me this evening. We typically would have kid coverage for this evening because my daughter found out Saturday after trying out Saturday morning that she's in a play, and that they had their first practice on Monday evening. And then our my baby my babysitter fell through. So, anyways, he's chilling here, hanging out, and can answer any kind of questions that y'all have in relation to what's it like to be a 6-year-old. Okay, um, which is kind of pertinent to the class. Um, and but typically that won't be the case, and so I appreciate your patience. Along those lines, I'm going to shoot for about 30-45 minute class at max, just because it's just a little bit more chaotic of a night. So the way this works every week, like I said last time, is kind of the point of our weekly meetings is to give you space to ask questions in relation to the topic, the weekly topic from the previous week. So in other words, I don't expect us to talk about next week's information tonight, or I'm sorry, this week's information tonight, or we would talk about last week's information. Doesn't really matter right now because this week and next week and uh, the first few weeks anyway are always kind of the same topic, which is neurodevelopment. But after that, it will matter. So if nobody has any questions, um, if we all just awkwardly stare at each other, and trust me, it does get awkward, which is great. It's great practice. Gets you feeling comfortable with being awkward. Um, I do have a few topics that I would like to discuss, particularly just a little bit more neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, the neurotransmitters, and then jumping quickly. And I'll talk about spend 3 minutes on that, and then diving as fast as we can into neurodevelopmental disorders in the DSM. Okay. But if we have enough questions, we'll probably cover most of that stuff anyway. Sound good? Awesome. Can't imagine if it didn't. I don't know what we would do. I always ask those questions. It's like, yeah, does this sound good? I just want somebody's like, actually, no, it doesn't. I guess I would just say noted. Neat. Um, okay.
Dr. Armstrong.
Yes, sir.
So what I was trying to understand, I mean, I was reading about it as far as like ADHD, in obviously adults and then in children,
Right.
right? Some of the skills, or I should say some of the symptoms, that's what I meant to say. Some of the symptoms are different, like noticeably different for children and obviously adults. I'm assuming it's just because the brain development, obviously in children, is not quite there yet, but I just wanted to make sure I understood what I was thinking as far as the reasoning behind that, as far as why the symptoms are like noticeably different.
Sure. Um, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up because it does, the answer to it is arrived at from understanding why there is even such a thing as ADHD. So, yes, your intuition there is completely correct. And the only thing I would add would be the there's not just a difference in development there as much as there's a different amount of expectations that the world places on that person as they get older, such that it might be normal for, let's say, a 10-year-old to struggle with, consistently doing their homework or paying attention while doing homework at night, but it might not be normal for a 16-year-old. And it's not just their age range, it's also the fact that, like, well, 16-year-olds also given a whole bunch more stuff. It's not exactly apples to apples as it relates to the level of expectations. But the problem is that ADHD in itself interferes with those types of variables. And in other words, you can see college students having huge discrepancies between, like, the type of math that they can do in their head and the fact that they can't drive, or the fact that they don't consistently take showers. And this is with ADHD, by the way. Or like a little kid with poor attention span at school that can watch, or that can play a sport for hours and hours and hours and hours without any problems on Saturdays. Yeah. And so it's all kind of contextual like that. Gosh, I said the only thing I would add, and I just kept on talking about it. Thanks for asking that question. Thanks for starting us off. Did I answer your question? I'm pretty sure I did.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Awesome.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I'm just genuinely curious why some of the disorders are contextually prefaced while others are not. But it just seems by what you just said and what I'm kind of learning from a lot of other classes is that it's all kind of relative to what the dominant culture is saying. And largely, like in the preface of the book, this is a westernized form of understanding.
Right.
And so, as we were talking about, a kid at 10 years old is, what we would say normally could do the such and such amount of homework. But like we're hominids and we weren't ever created, or we weren't really ever doing this type of thing until, the past 150 years. And so like what is normal and what is nominative, I guess, is why are only some of these disorders or symptoms qualified as, hey, take into consideration the context, whereas others are just like, these are facts.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And you are preaching at the preacher, and I'm right there with you. And I think it's good for us to verbally acknowledge out loud, and not us. We can do it all day long. It doesn't matter if we do. I wish the American Psychiatric Association would do the same. The people that came up with this stuff, because it's kind of weird that, like, we would say, well, yeah, but ADHD wouldn't be a thing, if you were a billionaire on an island that you owned and you didn't have any personal responsibility, you wouldn't have ADHD. But schizophrenia, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's all these, like, subjective ways of discerning it that don't seem very scientific. And the underlying question is, well, where in the world do they get this stuff from? Why do they do that? That's a great question, because as far as I'm aware, there are no answers to that, except for just, well, we just think that's the way it should be. Or that's the way we've always looked at it. I mean, I'm following you that there might be some more, science behind the pathophysiology for some of these disorders versus others. And that's in fact true. So like ADHD's got way more science behind it than disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Because that wasn't even a diagnosis until 2013? Yeah. And so there's zero evidence before then. But it begs the question, well, what role does the world have to play in, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not that we don't live in a perfect world. Yeah. And you're right. It's a categorical approach that medicine tries to take there, that where they really need to move towards a dimensional approach or a spectrum-based approach. Whereas we start saying, well, everybody has ADHD symptoms, but let's outline or identify what's normal amount of those symptoms across a range of ages. But instead, we just have like, they have trouble paying attention. Like, according to whom? If you ask them, they'll tell you, no, I'm doing okay. Every 6-year-old, I promise that I've tested, they're like, you ask them, like, you ever have trouble paying attention? Nope, never. Okay, we're good then. We're good. Mom, Dad, you'll go home. We're good. Yeah. I've also had, so it happens on this ends of, this is random, but that happens, that people saying that it happens on the ends of the age spectrum. The older you get, the more likely you're going to do that. Yeah. The younger you get, the more likely. And then the teens, every one of them have those like, I'm so glad you asked. Let me tell you all the stuff. Yeah. Who in here is planning on working with kids like for real, like in career? Nobody? All right. Bobby, you are? Nice.
I mean, I'm currently a 6th grade teacher
That's right.
at an intermediate school, and I'm doing school counseling. So
Yeah.
So when you're talking about that, like every 6th grader that I have in my class has a hard time paying attention at some point or another.
Right.
So then
Just
we
one
just
second.
have,
So sorry. Yes, sir. How can I help you?
Can I have something to eat?
Something to eat? I think Mama has some snacks in there, like those animal crackers. Can you go grab some of those? Okay, cool. Thank you, sir. Hey, will you grab me a pack? If there's like extra packs. Okay, sorry.
I mean,
it's a dude night tonight. Sorry. Just be glad we're not wearing camouflage and like eating raw meat, I guess. I don't know what stereotype dudes do. Whatever it is not what I do normally because I don't know what to do. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you a while ago, but you were talking, you teach 6th grade, intermediate, and
yeah. And I mean, at any point, half of them are not paying attention. Like you
Right.
ask a 6th grader and they're going to say the same thing. Yeah, I pay attention. And actually, I mean, they will. And even when I think they're not paying attention, I'll say, okay, what did we just talk about? And some of them can just spit it right out. But at the same time, then they have a hard time staying focused on maybe independent work or that sort of thing.
Yeah. And there's some truth to the statement that the longer you do this clinically, you do develop kind of a, like what's normal, abnormal, being able to kind of eyeball, not your own kids, that's never going to happen, but like other people's kids, you can kind of determine like, that's different, or, and I've seen, that's a common experience or whatever. But what's important, really, I want to make a note of that is, as it relates to diagnostics, you can see the limitations of just eyeballing, or even just going by self-report, especially with kids, right? Because you can't ask a kid about concepts that are beyond what they're neurologically capable of conceptualizing. you know, not you can't measure that reliably. And at any rate, because that's a problem, that's why there's psychological testing, just so you know. There are ways to objectively measure depression in kiddos. It's not as easy with adults, but there are ways to objectively measure it. Yeah. And attention span. We know what the average, 20-minute attention span for a 6-year-old is. It ain't great compared to adults, but but they actually, on average, they tend to perform similar to most like 13, 14-year-olds. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. 13, 14-year-olds have some hard times, folks. They're having some hard times. Yeah. Good questions. I just, this past Friday, I think I told you, presented at a little mini conference on ADHD. Did I tell you that I was doing that? Okay, I have no idea who I've told anything these days. I have no idea. So I did that this past Friday, and which went well. It's great. And I will send you the presentation resources and materials, or I'll upload them in Moodle for y'all, because there's some updated stuff in there that's important. Where it's up to you guys, and unless y'all have other questions that you want to ask about other topics, I can also fill our time with plenty of information related to ADHD. It's up to you. But I don't want to take over if you have questions related to like anything else like autism or learning disorders and intellectual disorders, speech language disorders, tics, Tourette's, right? Learning, or go ahead.
Oh, I'm curious just about how you differentiate between when, either autism or ADHD are triggered by a traumatic event, and if that changes how you treat it.
It's a great question. So there's kind of, and that's a question that kind of hits closer to home for me, only because I once had a therapist that was my therapist, wasn't my therapist for long, honestly, that tried to convince me that it was just my trauma and that ADHD doesn't really exist. I know that's not what you're asking, but I remember that like throwing my world off into, chaos psychologically for a while, which has been a while ago. And I've come across that story several times, experienced by patients of mine, where there's kind of a myth that there's a bunch of kiddos out there that are walking around with trauma who've been misdiagnosed with ADHD. When I say there's a myth, it's undoubtable that there's a lot of kids who have ADHD that people haven't also seen the trauma, but there's almost like a stigma. It's like, yeah, but it's not really ADHD. We wouldn't have all these people needing meds. All these kids need meds. Yes, sir. Huh? What? Oh, okay, you need some water? Hey, can y'all give me like 2 minutes? I gotta get my man a drink of water. Okay, just a second. Man, he is the most handsome little dude I've ever seen. Hey, thanks, guys. I'm sorry for the wait there, but I think we're all good. We got our water. So I think I was going to talk about ADHD some more, unless we had other questions. That's pretty good working memory at this time of night, folks. I think I'm okay. Meet my own expectations there. Good. Gosh, and so it won't be just tonight. Obviously, we've got technically one more week in the neurodevelopmental disorders after tonight. But we will be absolutely integrating all that information as we move along, because really almost all neurodevelopmental disorders increases the probability of there eventually being an additional diagnosis. What was that noise, Bubba? Oh, you can't hear me. He's got headphones on. All right. So let's talk about ADHD. Some big concepts. Gosh, well, get ready. So here we go. Number one, it's going to blow your mind. This is the research that I've landed on. Nobody on the planet can ever say they're 100% sure, but I'm as sure as I possibly could be at this moment in time of this fact. So much so that I would not hesitate to say it in court, and I would be able to provide some of the research that supports it. Not some of it. I guess I would have to provide all of it, but excuse me. And that is that 1/3 of the world population have the genetic predisposition or risk for developing ADHD, autism, OCD, Tourette's and tics, schizophrenia, and bipolar. And if you're going to say bipolar, then you have to include depression in there too. You're like, whoa, you're saying 1/3 of the world has those diagnoses? Nope, not. What I'm saying is developmentally, especially this is true for kids, developmentally, we live in a world that has increasingly become more difficult or designed more so around 2/3 of the world population and how their brains work as compared to 1/3 of the population. So there's 1/3 of us out there living a harder life beginning in childhood. And I say a harder life, not like environmentally harder necessarily as much as it is, well, for example, our sleep cycles. I may have mentioned it last week, but 1/3 of us have delayed onset circadian rhythm, meaning that our brains don't produce melatonin. And this begins by, you're born with this, it's innate. This means that our brains don't start producing melatonin in the evening until about between 12 and 2 a.m. Whereas the other 2/3 of the world population tend to have melatonin production start around between 9 and 12. Yeah. Which also means that when you delay melatonin onset, by the way, you can dive into this research, it's there. It pushes back the waking up schedule hormonally. And I don't know if you've dropped any kids off recently, like elementary school kids off. But folks, they start school at 7:30 in the morning. I've never seen a smiling face walking in that school, except for the teachers. I don't know how they do it, man. And the principals, they're all like cheering and stuff. They have to. It's a feat. It's an accomplishment to make it there. They have like every day feels like a parade whenever we drop the kids off. It's like, yeah. But that's so 1/3 of those kiddos, their brains aren't going to wake up until about 12 p.m. Now, hear me on this is that all the 2/3 plus the 1/3, all kids, I'm sorry, the other 2/3, their brains don't wake up until 10 a.m. So that's not just true for kids. When I say kids, that principle applies for all adults too, for that matter. But here we are, year 2023. We've had that data around for a good 20 years at least, because I remember reading it in a book about 20 years ago. And we're still having school at 7:30. So even if that were just the case, and we know that to be true, and even if every kid on the planet had the perfect no stress, perfect childhood, great parents, everything was just perfect, except for that thing. In my opinion, the biology behind that means that we've got 1/3 of kids that have elevated cortisol levels during neurodevelopment. Would y'all agree with that? On average, they would have a higher, that makes sense, they would have higher cortisol levels, which is stress hormone. And I don't know if you know, but cortisol in your brain, especially the connections between the neurons, are not friends. Your brain does, the dendrites and the connections between dendrites and the dendritic axonal connections do not like cortisol. It's like dissolving. It's like I almost said pine sol. You remember pine sol? Man, I'm pretty sure I used to brush my teeth with pine sol. Like we used to use it for everything. Like I remember my dad washing cars with it, and like, who knows? Like everything smelled like pine sol my whole life growing up. Taking showers with washing my hair with pine sol. So I'm saying that because pine sol, in my mind, could disintegrate stuff, and that's what cortisol would become, is kind of cytotoxic, and it would start killing off or degrading those connections. And if you have that happen during, it's like taking the nails away from the builders of a house, and then still expecting that house to be, functional house at the end, or even along the way, you're going to have doors falling off and all kinds of stuff simply because you're taking the stuff away from it. That's what chronic stress does to the brain. The other thing I would say is this, is that because we're making kids wake up so early, all of them, we've had several generations now of chronic insomnia for at least 1/3 of the population. And that would be true even if we were perfectly making sure they went to bed every single time at the same time and so forth. But we are forcing their brains outside of their biological rhythm. And that by itself, I've got no doubt, has been a part of the reason why we're seeing more of this along the way. Because what's happening to everybody's schedules, they're like getting very like rigidly like compact, right? We're packing in 17 activities between now and 10 p.m. We've got a bunch of stuff to do. So like, I think that's a big issue. The other issue as it relates to ADHD is we have only, I would say fairly recently, in the past maybe 10 years or so, identified that there's a bimodal distribution of who has ADHD across the IQ spectrum. I'll give you an example. I'm going to share my screen here in a second. I'm going to show you a normal bell curve so I can explain what I mean by that. Everybody's like, that guy's just making that word up. No, that's a real word. But what's cool is that when you guys graduate with your masters, everybody's gonna be like, "Oh, you did so great." Okay, I know they're super smart. Just make up words when they're around people, and be like, "Ah, see, I told you." They said basal ganglia. I know. I mean, I don't even know what that is, but they sound like that. That made sense. Can y'all see this bell curve here? All right. So ADHD occurs not in a normal bell curve like this. You would expect in the normal population, and which is true from a lot of other disorders, for example. It's like depression and anxiety, things like that in general tend to have more of a normal distribution across the IQ spectrum. Kind of depends on what we're talking about, but ADHD has a relatively lower, hang on, let me get my annotation tool here. That's not it. I was telling my last class, do y'all feel like they move buttons around like every week when you open up an application? You're like, what is this application? And it makes you feel like you're losing your mind, right? I'm here to attest, especially with Adobe stuff. They do it all the time. You're not losing your mind. You're at least, if you are, there's at least two of us, because I also feel that way a lot. Anyway, I don't have to have a pen. Oh, here we go. Got it. As soon as I said it. So the average IQ is 100. A 98th percentile would be a 130. And a second percentile would be a 70 IQ. Let's just fill it in here. Okay. With ADHD, very few people, or a relatively or statistically significant number of people with ADHD have either really low IQs or really high IQs. The prevalence for ADHD goes down in the middle of the IQ distribution. So I thought that was interesting because I've never, when you think about it, it does make sense, but it's interesting because we think about ADHD kind of being like, you know, any kid that's ever born, what's the chance of them having ADHD? It should be the same regardless of their IQ. Those don't necessarily seem linked, although obviously we know different, but on the face of it, doesn't seem to be linked. In other words, why should somebody with an average IQ have any less chance of having ADHD than somebody with a high IQ? Especially in that case, because a higher IQ, they should be doing better. Shouldn't have trouble paying attention, right? Well, I'll speed the conversation up here just to get us through a little bit more information. As it turns out, folks with lower IQs in general don't occur all that often in the typical population. Now, statistically they do, because it doesn't matter who you give it to, you're always going to have, you have to have low scores. But our IQ test didn't rule out, or also included, they were normed on people with all kinds of genetic disorders and things like that, because you can't screen for everything. So as it turns out, low IQ generally, on average, relates to something causing that low IQ. And this is an important concept to remember for your intellectual developmental disorders section 2, is that if you're born with a low IQ, it's probably you've got some sort of genetic condition that caused it. It caused an abnormality in your neurodevelopment. If you have a low IQ, there's just a higher chance that something happened to you, you know, whether in utero or in early childhood, that affected your brain's overall trajectory. And so it makes sense that people with lower IQs have a higher chance of having ADHD simply because they've had some sort of injury, disease, or illness that caused a low IQ to begin with. For people with high IQs, or the higher the IQ goes, and this is where it gets interesting to me. I mean, it's interesting on that side too, but really interesting is that despite having a high IQ, what it means is you've got more connections between your neurons than what you need. And you have more connections like that compared to your peers starting from day one. So if I ask, the average 6-year-old, or if I say zebra to the average 6-year-old, they may have 10 thoughts that they can associate with zebras, right? Well, with a kid with a gifted intelligence, just for the sake of argument, let's say they have 50. That's a quantifiable way of measuring the density of connection between neurons. We know that to be true. Because whenever I say the word, pizza, I know all of you, because you're in grad school, are gifted intellectually, which means that you can think of a whole bunch of stuff related to pizza. Tonight, you're going to have trouble probably falling asleep because you're still thinking about pizza. Yeah. But the challenge is that, or I would say the difference between you as an adult right now and a 6-year-old is that they've got that level or capacity. They've got an age advanced. Like if you look at mental age, if they're 6 years old, let's say that they're thinking of 50 things, and that's closer to about what a 12-year-old would think, the average 12-year-old. So in other words, they're trying to process the amount of information a 12-year-old would, but with the 6-year-old frontal lobe, even if that's perfect. And I don't know about you, I've never driven a Ferrari, but I would imagine it's pretty anxiety provoking to drive a car that your steering wheel and your brake pedal and your gas pedal are designed for a Corolla, but you're trying to drive a Ferrari around. I'd be terrified. I would. Hey, man. What happened? Oh, it got turned off. Sorry. Here. Sorry, guys. Give me 1 second. Here you go. Just keep that on. It should connect automatically. It did? So in other words, again, here we've got, by the way, essentially 1/3 of the world population have and actually that's about what you get number wise, have an IQ between actually you don't even have to know this for a fact. This math. What's 73? What's 100 minus 33? Everybody's like, man, not this time of night. It's not that kind of math, guys. 67, right? Everybody agree with that? 67 plus 30. I think that's right. Yes, sir.
My thing is like I put my headphones on, but I can't hear it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll let you try these on.
Oh, they still haven't connected. Let me see. Can I see it? Sorry. We have a crisis with our headphones not connecting. Yes, sir. I know. It was very cringy. So it says it's connected, Bubba. How about, hey, maybe try closing out of that one and then reopening it. Okay, because it's connected to your iPad there. Here you go. Okay. Man, can you imagine what people used to do like in the olden times without iPads and headphones and stuff? They just talk to their kids, I guess. I'm just kidding. I talk to my kids. We talk about psychology. No, we do not. My kids know not to ask me questions related to that stuff. Like, nope, not unless we want to go to sleep, Dad. I'm trying to remember the thought I was making or the point I was making. All right, so we've got 1/3 of the world population who have the genetic predisposition toward becoming uh, increasingly more intelligent as they get older. And that's the gifted range there. But what we do know is that, I mean, if you only know that cortisol comes from stress and that it's probably stressful or more stressful on average to have too many thoughts that your frontal lobe can't handle, has a hard time prioritizing. And if you do that long enough, it degrades, takes away the nails from the house builders of the frontal lobe. That makes sense? And so what ends up happening is when you add that, that does not mean that every kid who's gifted has ADHD. What it means is that you add that plus anything else, and it doesn't take much in that population, and you get ADHD. Yes, sir.
Still not doing it.
It's still not working? That's strange.
It said connecting to daddy's iPad.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I heard it say connecting to daddy's iPad. Please wait for a minute.
It said, please wait for a minute. Is that what it said?
No, I don't know how
If
to.
it says that, turn it off because it's never said that to me. That'd be terrifying. Guys, give me 2 seconds. Thank you for your patience. Real quick. Crisis averted, folks. We have figured it out. I think. Hey, Bubba. It's not working again? Yeah. I think we accidentally turned it off.
Oh, nice.
Well,
What's it a nice thing to do?
the crisis averted. Give me 2 seconds. I'm so sorry. Hey, thank you guys for your patience. Appreciate it. figured it out. I know what people did before that technology. They didn't worry about that stuff. Right? They didn't have those kinds of conversations. Is it connected to my iPhone or your iPad or your computer? No. So does that make sense as we're talking about with IQs as they increase? It just kind of makes logical sense that we've got an increase in stress. When I say stress, it's just a subjective experience or a subjective psychology that is more difficult than the other 2/3 of the population. Actually, technically, in that case, more difficult, at least from a cortisol standpoint, than what is that? That'd be, yeah, 1/3 of the world population. Kind of fitting in there. I'm sorry, 50% of the population. That's the average range. Everybody's like, Dr. A, you're using numbers and stuff, and it's like 8 p.m. I thought this class is about psychopathology. Why are we talking about math? That's all the math I've got, I promise. But another big concept for ADHD is that, as you read, it kind of operates, or the concept of it being a thing or a diagnosis stems at or begins with, it is a discrete condition, right? In other words, you can have comorbidities, you can have things that can be diagnosed along with it, but it is fundamentally discrete from autism. That's what the DSM-5 says, right? And that's what the DSM-5 definitely does say as of 2022 even. But I'm here to tell you, that's wrong from a science standpoint. You can go back even 10 years ago, and it doesn't align with the research. And a lot of people don't agree with the DSM-5 because of that reason. I feel like I'm just talking bad about it, but my point there, and the reason why it's important for you to know, because you're like, yeah, but we still need to know the DSM-5. You need to understand that you're not going to ever see a picture perfect diagnosis. Okay? It is more common for you to feel, I would say, a little bit confused clinically and overwhelmed, especially at first, because you're like, well, is this generalized anxiety disorder? Because that's a different treatment plan than major depression, or is this ADHD or DMDD? Like, and you will get lost and you will stress yourself out over that and over things that people just made up. That's my point. Now, the truth is that ADHD has many different causes. We've identified 2, right? Like intellectual disorder is often, not always, but almost always associated with ADHD. And the higher your IQ goes, there's probably an increased chance of you having ADHD. What are some, is it possible to just to be born with it? Ooh, that's a tricky question. Is it possible to be born with ADHD? So that's a trick question. I shouldn't be playing tricks on you guys this time of night. I'm so sorry. And it's only funny to me because, like, who cares? Like, that's the nerdiest way for a professor to be, like, kind of mean. So you can have the genetic predisposition, and so much so that it doesn't matter. You could have perfect childhood, and you're going to have the right stars. You've already got the right stars aligned. And it's going to produce the symptoms that will someday match the DSM-5's ADHD diagnosis, right? That's possible. But it's a trick question because I've never met a newborn that met the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, nor could you make a diagnosis down that young, right? So they're not born with it, but they are. So yes and no. Okay. Again, this question lies like how young can we go as far as the diagnosis? Well, I have made the diagnosis down to age 3. You won't see a lot of I'll say this. The younger a kid gets, the more difficult it is to objectively assess if they're normal or not as it relates to executive functioning and attention. So while it's possible, and it would be theoretically, it'd be possible to evaluate an infant and diagnose them with ADHD, but we have no idea. There's such a wide range there that if we measure something at any one point in time of the brain, let's say at 8 months or even at 3 years, it might not be that they actually have something. It could just be they were lagging behind in that one domain for whatever reason, just a unique outlier. I have diagnosed it down to age 3 though, because that kiddo came from a very complicated and well-documented brain injury at birth. So that like nobody is going to argue or question like, yeah, something bad happened to the brain, changed its developmental trajectory. I'm here to tell you that lower developmental trajectory absolutely has caused their ADHD symptoms right now at age 3. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to have it for the rest of their life, because we also know 1/3 of all kids who are diagnosed with ADHD grow out of it. They always say that it's like, yeah, but they grow out of it. Like it's a pot. Like, no, that's not really the best way to say it, because it's probably more so that 1/3 just get real good at masking it or live in an environment that has a lot more surrogate frontal lobes than the other ones. Yeah.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
How old or how often are kids from like 3 to let's say like kindergarten or first grade, how often are they diagnosed with ADHD?
How often are they diagnosed at that age?
Yeah,
Like,
because I noticed a lot of diagnosis in like adolescence and up.
oh,
But
I see what you're saying. Yeah. How often are they identified during that time? Is that what you're asking?
yeah.
Yeah. I tend to see, that's a great question. Great question. And it makes a lot of sense too. So like 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds get diagnosed a whole lot more than 7, 8, and 9-year-olds. But then 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds, there's an uptick there. And then there's another uptick around 13, 14, and then certainly like 15. And then, 13, 14, and then another one between 18 and 19. Why is that true?
That was going to be my next question, actually.
Tressa, looks like you may have an idea. I say that
Just
right, Tressa?
The brain,
Yeah.
yeah, Tressa. The brain development, there's a changing period during that time when they're
Sure.
learning more. Is that right?
And they're making there are big leaps. So in other words, what you're saying is there's a difference in their neurodevelopment, as it were, compared to their peers. And now we've entered an age that their peers are being required to make leaps in personal responsibilities and things like that their frontal lobes are not ready to make.
Kindergarten
Mhm.
time.
Can't tell you it's not indicative that kid's going to always meet the diagnostic criteria, but I can tell you that's like it's like a crucible almost, where we're going to really pinpoint. And it's, if you've never seen it before, there's a very clear observational difference between the kindergartners who do have it versus those who don't, and their ability to not disrupt class. And if there's one kid in that class, which is usually a couple, we just know that by stats alone. I don't know how in the world our kindergarten teachers are not forcing everybody to pay them like millions of dollars to do what they do, because they're trying to teach, and they got one kid. I mean, I've seen a kid jump up on my desk one time. I'm telling you, I was interviewing, and it was like they were so fast, and then their impulsivity, they jumped up on my desk, started taking the clock apart before I could even like react. That's what I'm saying. You're going to develop some norms in your head for all this stuff, just observationally. You're like, yep. I mean, I can't officially say anything, but I'm just eyeballing that, and I know that that's not typical, right? So you start to see the separation in that gap there, and then especially between fourth and fifth grade, because they usually jump up into like intermediate school. They go from like having parades in the morning, like, well, here's a cupcake for today, guys, to like, now you got homework. I don't care why you didn't turn in. You got a 0. It's like they start their real job in fourth, fifth grade, and that's an executive functioning leap that a lot of those kids can't make. With that said, our education system is not designed around what we know about the brain. So it's always hard as a teacher, right? Because we're pushing kids just beyond their it's called the zone of proximal development. I think it was Noam Chomsky, is that right? Who came up with the theory of like learning takes place by just pushing beyond what you already know. But if you go too far, that's why we have scaffolding or learning. But if you go too far, it's unrealistic to expect learning to occur because we haven't built to that frame yet. Unfortunately, not a lot in education. There's nothing against teachers. It's actually support how hard of a job they have. Most of our curriculum is not designed around that concept. It's just like, well, what do y'all think sixth graders should do? Well, I think they should be able to work full time and probably, have a mortgage. Like we've just made up stuff. And I think, and nobody's asking this question, and this is a big question I'm trying to figure out in the research, and I can't find the answer to. I think an increase in prevalence for ADHD is also occurring because our standards for what we think kids should be able to do don't align very well with what they're actually neurologically capable. And I know that only just by eyeballing the fact that my son had homework. He's in first grade. Until we get rid of homework, I'm not going to listen to anybody in the school decision-making setting, except for teachers. I always listen to y'all, but because that's just all willy-nilly. I don't even give homework to my adult counseling clients, man. Come on. I can expect a kid not to. It's like, oh yeah, I can't wait to do some more spelling right when I get home. That's what I want to do. No. Anyway, my point with all this is that we've got populations of kiddos in those age ranges that, on top of being in an imperfect system, are also having a harder time. And ADHD causes the frontal lobe to be delayed in maturity, by, I would say, and it's a range. We don't know what that range exactly is, but it's probably between like 6 months to 5 years in the severe cases. But you can see it prominently in kindergarten because you'd be like, that kid is acting like the kids do in like the 2 and 3-year-old classes. And if they have ADHD and you subtract 2 or 3 years off their actual age, well, that's about what their frontal lobe's acting like. Does that make sense? Yeah. Awesome. Gosh, there's so much more. With the teens, a lot of times this is just a good fact to know about ADHD. A lot of kids with high IQs won't get identified until college. Why y'all think that's the case?
They use that high IQ to compensate and come up with other strategies to mask them.
Absolutely. I don't know about y'all, and I'm not saying like high IQ, like because I'm not super duper high IQ. I'm higher. I'm in that third, but I remember like trying hard, about 40% hard in high school, making straight A's. I just remember thinking, how in the world do you not make straight A's in high school? Like, how did that happen? I remember having friends like, I'm failing math. It's like, I don't know how that happened. But what happens is that these kids go from like not having to try, and probably they've got at least one parent or caretaker that has been their frontal lobe their whole life. And they are like, all right, yeah, I made straight A's high school. I'm gonna move across the country, live by myself. Right? Don't know how to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich, but let's do that. Move across the country, and all of a sudden the bottom falls out. We have this straight A student making, not even showing up to class anymore. Yeah. Then they get misdiagnosed a lot with depression first. Psychiatrists love to do that. And I don't necessarily blame them because, man, I don't want to have to deal with all the paperwork of DEA or people, DEA showing up and put me in prison, stuff like that. I get it. They want to jump on depression diagnosis first. But when you see a 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old for the first time ever drop off like that functionally, I hope you first think about their neurodevelopment. Because if they're in college, that means they're in that 1/3 that could intellectually do it. Okay? And it's not always the case. Sometimes it is depression. Sometimes it's prodromal schizophrenia and all kinds of stuff. But in most cases, when that drop occurs at about 18, 19, functionally, we fell out of college or whatever, we have to move back across the country and shamefully walk around while we figure out what we're doing at community college. I say that from personal experience, by the way. I can tell you, when that happens, there's a good chance that it was ADHD that caused it because our frontal lobes were too far away in proximity. I used to get phone calls from my mom. Oh gosh, it made me so mad. I was like a junior in college. My mom would call me at 8 a.m., ask me if I was going to class that day. That's not normal, people. I was like 30 years old. I wasn't really 30. I was like 20 years old. But that's that. First of all, I'm thankful. I hated it at the time. I'm thankful now. I wouldn't have made it. Wasn't necessarily always healthy. But at the same time, I get it as a parent. It's just hard. You're just like, I don't want them to crash. But I would not be a doctor today if my mom didn't call me at 8 a.m. But sometimes there's no connection there, or the frontal lobe's like, all right, I'm done. We out. And then there's a big concern of like, what happened? It's like you went to college, probably the liberal college that you went to, probably fell apart. Yep, those professors. Nope. A lot of times it's ADHD in most cases. All right, I'm gonna wrap this up there because I do have my next class. Thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging in there. I know I have a lot more energy than you guys, and that's okay. I'm not judging you. I just am very excited and passionate about this topic because y'all are going to take this information and help so many people, and it makes me excited because not very many people know this stuff in our world. They don't. If you went and talked about any of these concepts to a pediatrician right now, their eyes would go crossed, and then they'd be like, "Oh, that's cool," and then just walk away, pretend like they didn't hear any of that. I'm telling you, because it happens to me all the time. My kids' pediatricians like avoid, like they try to like get the nurse practitioner in there whenever they see me bring the kids up there. Like we're not bringing Dr. Armstrong because we're gonna have to talk about stuff I'm uncomfortable talking about. So, all right, y'all have a great night. See you next week.